Hello, friends. We are interested in the geography of our views, so please like and write in the comments from which city are you watching us and were there loud stories of betrayal in your city. Perhaps the next story about betrayal will be from your city, and we start. Morning light filtered through the tattered blinds of a house on the outskirts of Lincoln Hills, a small Ohio town where rusty pickup trucks and peeling signs were as common as the smell of fries from the corner diner. Tony Richardson, a broad-shouldered man with tired eyes and stubble that he hadn't bothered to shave, stood at the stove, flipping a pancake in a frying pan. The oil sizzled, and the smell of cinnamon mixed with the light aroma of coffee from the old coffee maker that hummed on the countertop. He was 36, but the last 9 years of his marriage to Amy had added wrinkles to him that he had not noticed in the mirror until recently. "Jack, Sophie, come quickly. The school bus won't be waiting for you," he shouted over his shoulder without turning around. His voice was hoarse, as if he had been yelling all night at a football game, when in fact he was just sleeping with his mouth open on the sagging sofa in the living room. Jack, an 8-year-old boy with wild brown hair and freckles, burst into the kitchen, his sneakers slapping against the linoleum. In his hands he was clutching a backpack with the Spider-Man logo, which was already beginning to tear at the seams. "Dad, did you burn the pancake again?" Jack wrinkled his nose, looking at the slightly burnt edge of the frying pan. "I didn't burn it, I fried it properly," Tony muttered, transferring the pancake to a plate. "Eat while it's warm. Where is your sister?" "Sophie is still tinkering with the dolls." Jack rolled his eyes, plopping down on a chair. "She said that Barbie was late for work today, and she needed help getting ready." Tony snorted, shaking his head. He sipped his coffee from the best dad mug that Amy had given him 5 years ago, when such words still meant something. Now the mug was just comfortable, with a broken handle, but he still didn't change it. The door to the hallway creaked, and Amy walked into the kitchen. She was 34, but the dark circles under her eyes and slightly unkempt tail made her look older. She was wearing a gray sweatshirt with a logo of Lincoln Hills High School, where she worked as an administrator, and jeans that she had not changed for 3 days. In her hands is a stack of papers that she clearly intended to check before work. "Sophie, move, or I'll choose your clothes myself," she shouted towards the stairs, throwing the papers on the table. Then she looked at Tony. "Did you pick up the check from the mail yesterday?" Tony froze with the spatula in his hand, looking at it over the top of the frying pan. "What check?" "From Insurance Tony. The one that was supposed to come last week." Her voice was level, but there was irritation in it, as if she already knew the answer. "Damn, I forgot." He scratched the back of his head, looking away. "After the shift, I was squeezed like a lemon. I'll pick it up tomorrow." "Tomorrow?" Amy narrowed her eyes, crossing her arms. "We need to pay the mortgage by the end of the week, or the bank will start sending letters again." "Do you even realize how much we are already in the red?" "I understand, Amy." Tony threw the spatula into the sink, and it clanged on the metal surface. "I work 10 hours at the factory so that we can live here at all." "Maybe you should go get the check yourself, since you're so impatient." Amy opened her mouth to answer, but then Sophie ran into the kitchen, a small copy of her mother with the same blonde hair, only braided in 2 pigtails. In her hands, she was holding a Barbie doll in a pink dress. "Mom, look, I did her hair." Sophie proudly raised the doll, not noticing the tension between her parents. Amy exhaled, forcing herself to smile. "Very beautiful, honey. But let's put on a jacket. The bus is already honking." Outside the window, the horn of a yellow school bus parked outside their house actually sounded. Jack grabbed his pancake, stuffed it whole into his mouth, and ran out the door, shouting something inaudible. Sophie ran after him, leaving Barbie on the table. Amy grabbed the children's backpacks and hurried after them, calling over her shoulder. "Tony, seriously, sort out the check. I don't want to blush in front of the bank again." The door slammed and Tony was left alone in the kitchen. He turned off the stove, looking at the remaining dough in the bowl. "Deal with the check," he mimicked her tone in a whisper, rubbing his temples. Then he finished his coffee and went to get ready for the factory. His old Ford was waiting in the yard, covered in a thin layer of morning dew. The day dragged on as usual. Tony spent it at the factory, amid the roar of machines and the smell of machine oil. He turned bolts, checked parts, exchanged a few words with colleagues. Everything was on autopilot. During his lunch break, he sat in the break room, munching on the ham sandwich Amy had packed for him that morning. Opposite him sat Bob, a big man with a graying beard who had worked at the plant longer than Tony had lived in this town. "How are things at home, Tony?" Bob asked, opening a can of cola. As usual, Tony shrugged, taking a bite. "Amy is nagging about money again. The children are running around like crazy. Nothing new." 9 years of marriage, huh? Bob chuckled. "I had the same thing with Marge. Then you get used to it. Or you get divorced." "Divorce?" Tony chuckled, but there was no amusement in his voice. "No, we are not one of those. Just tired, I guess." "Tired," Bob repeated, nodding. "Do you know what helps? Evening at the bar. Rusty Anchor is 2 blocks away. The beer is cheap, and the girls behind the bar are not boring." Tony remained silent, looking out the window at the gray sky. He had already gone to that bar a couple of times after his shift. Nothing special, just drink a beer, listen to an old jukebox, chat with someone who doesn't ask about mortgages. But today, the thought of a bar seemed a little more tempting to him than usual. Meanwhile, Amy sat in her office at school, littered with folders and sticky notes with reminders. The phone rang every 5 minutes. Either parents complained about the schedule or teachers asked to print something urgently. She loved her job, but lately every day seemed endless. At lunchtime, she went into the staff room where her colleague, Miss Jenkins, was drinking tea from a huge mug. "Amy, you look like you haven't slept in a week," Jenkins noted, adjusting her glasses. "Everything is fine?" "Yes," Amy waved her hand, pouring herself some coffee. "Children, work, Tony." All at once, Tony came back late again. Jenkins raised an eyebrow. "Yesterday at 11, Amy sighed. "He said that he was late at the plant, but I heard him rattling his keys. He smelled like beer." "Oh, guys," Jenkins shook her head. "My ex also started with delays. Then I found lipstick on his shirt. Have you talked to him?" "I tried," Amy shrugged. "He just snaps. He says that I am drinking with him. Maybe I'm drinking, but damn, I just want him to be home." Jenkins patted her on the shoulder. "Give him time, or kick him harder to wake him up." Amy smiled at the corner of her lips, but something tightened inside her. She returned to the office, looking at the family photo on the table, her and Tony and the children at the lake 3 years ago. Then they laughed. Now she couldn't remember the last time she heard him laugh. Evening fell on Lincoln Hills. Tony returned home at 7, throwing his jacket on his chair. Amy was making dinner, macaroni and cheese from a box, nothing special. Jack and Sophie raced around the living room, playing tag while the TV blared an ad for a new Dodge pickup. "How is the day?" Amy asked without turning around from the stove. "Okay," Tony opened the refrigerator, taking out a beer. "And you?" "Likewise." She stirred the pasta. Jack tore up the notebook again, and Sophie threw a tantrum because I didn't buy her a new marker. "Children," Tony chuckled, opening the jar. "Maybe we can go somewhere tomorrow. To the park or something." "To the park?" Amy finally looked at him, surprised. "Where does the money come from? We can barely make it." "Jesus, Amy, I was just suggesting." Tony rolled his eyes, taking a sip of his beer. "Forget." She pursed her lips, returning to the stove. The conversation died down, as always. After dinner, Tony helped put the kids to bed, and then sat on the couch with another can of beer. Amy went into the bedroom with a book that she did not read, but simply held in her hands, looking at the ceiling. This is how their days passed: routine, debts, short phrases, instead of conversations. The closeness between them had long since disappeared into bills and fatigue, leaving only the habit of living under the same roof. The sun had already set behind the Lincoln Hills horizon, leaving the sky streaked with gray-orange, when Tony Richardson turned off the main road towards the Rusty Anchor. The bar stood on the corner of an old highway surrounded by beat-up pickup trucks and a neon sign with the letter R blinking like it was about to burn out. The inside smelled of spilled beer, fried wings, and something vaguely old, maybe wood paneling that hadn't been cleaned since the Reagan era. A jukebox in the corner played some country tunes while a few regulars chatted idly behind the counter. Tony pushed the door open and walked to the bar, throwing his jacket over the back of his chair. His shift at the plant ended an hour ago, but he didn't want to go home. There were bills waiting, children's noise, and Amy's gaze, which lately seems colder to him than the February wind. Here it was simpler. No one asked why he was silent. "Hey, Tony," Kate, a bartender with short dark hair and a rose tattoo on her wrist, placed a bottle of Budweiser in front of him without waiting for his order. "Ordinary?" "Yeah," he nodded, wrapping his fingers around the cold glass. "How are you?" "Better than yours, judging by your face," she grinned, wiping the counter with a rag. "Has the shift run out again?" As always, Tony took a sip, feeling the beer pleasantly burn his throat. 10 hours of bolts and iron. Then home, and there, well, you understand. Kate chuckled without going into detail. She saw people like Tony, everyday tired workers who came here to forget about everything at least for a couple of hours. A minute later, Bob, his colleague from the factory, approached the counter with a red face and a loud laugh. "Tony, do you officially live here now?" Bob slapped him on the shoulder, almost spilling his beer. "Amy hasn't kicked you out yet?" "As long as he endures," Tony grinned, but a shadow slipped into his voice. "She doesn't have time to kick them out. She's busy with children and papers." "Well, then drink." Bob raised the bottle. "For the patience of our wives, so that it doesn't end." They clinked glasses, and the conversation flowed on about the plant, about how the boss was cutting breaks again, about the football match that was shown last weekend. Tony relaxed, letting the noise of the bar drown out his thoughts of home. One Budweiser gave way to a second, then a third. The clock on the wall showed 9 o'clock in the evening when he finally looked at his phone. Message from Amy. "Where are you?" he sighed, but did not answer. He would still say that he was late at work. Meanwhile, at the Richardson house, Amy sat on the couch with her legs tucked under her. A folder with a schedule of school events lay open on her lap, but she didn't read it. She just stared into space. Jack and Sophie were already asleep upstairs, leaving the living room in silence, broken only by the ticking of the wall clock. Tony didn't show up for dinner again, and the macaroni and cheese she was making was cold in the pan on the stove. She took the phone and sent a message. "Where are you?" There was no answer. Amy threw the phone on the pillow and rubbed her temples. In recent weeks, Tony had been returning later and later, and each time he smelled of beer. He said it was just a couple of bottles with the guys, but that didn't reassure her. She knew he was tired. She was tired too, damn it, but his aloofness cut deeper than she cared to admit. The doorbell made her jump. Amy stood up, straightened her jacket, and went to open it. Standing in the doorway was Dan Miller, their neighbor 2 doors down. Tall, with disheveled hair and a grin that always gave Amy goosebumps. He was wearing a leather jacket and jeans, and in his hands was a bag from the supermarket. "Hi, Amy," he smiled wider than necessary. "I was walking past and saw the light. I thought I'd drop you something. I bought an extra bag of cookies from Walmart, but my house is already full." "Oh, hi, Dan." Amy hesitated, holding the door half open. "Thank you, but we're fine, don't." "Come on, it's just cookies." He held out the bag, as if not noticing her uncertainty. "How are you? Is Tony home?" "No, he is late at work." She took the bag to quickly end the conversation. "Thank you, really. Good night." "If anything, come in," Dan winked, stepping back. "I'm always at home, you know." Amy closed the door, feeling her face burn. Dan was famous in Lincoln Hills, a guy who changed girls more often than the oil in his old Chevy. She didn't trust him, but he had lived nearby for 3 years, and his random visits had become routine. Usually he just chatted, asking about the weather or the kids, but today there was something else in his tone, something she didn't like. She returned to the couch, throwing the cookies on the table. The phone was still silent. Amy turned on the TV to drown out the silence, but her thoughts revolved around Tony. Where is he? Why doesn't he answer? And why does she increasingly find herself waiting for at least some sign from him that he still notices her? In Rusty Anchor, time passed unnoticed. Tony was finishing his third bottle when Kate placed a bowl of nuts in front of him. Here, have a bite, otherwise you'll fall. She nodded towards the bowl. You're kind of thoughtful today. It's just a lousy day, he shrugged, popping a nut into his mouth. At home, Amy started talking about money again. I suggested to her about the park, and she said, "Where does the money come from? It's like I'm not trying." Wives are like that, Kate shrugged, wiping her glass. My sister also nags her husband, and he just wants silence sometimes, you know. Exactly, Tony nodded, looking at the foam in the bottle. Silence, that's what I'm missing. The conversation was interrupted by Bob, who returned from the slot machine in the corner, loudly swearing at the damn machine that eats quarters. Tony laughed, and for a moment everything became simpler: the bar, the beer, the jokes. But my head was still spinning. Where are you? He knew that Amy was waiting for an answer, but he did not write. Let him think what he wants. At home, Amy turned off the TV and went up to the bedroom. Passing by the window, she noticed that the light in Dan's house was still on. She shuddered. She lay down in bed, pulling the blanket up to her chin, but sleep did not come. Instead, she imagined Tony, somewhere out there, beer in hand, laughing with someone who wasn't her. And for the first time in a long time, she became truly afraid that they were losing each other. It was almost 11 when Tony finally returned. He quietly opened the door, threw the keys on the nightstand, and walked into the living room. Amy was asleep or pretending to be, and he didn't wake her. Instead, he collapsed on the couch, staring at the ceiling. The beer was still buzzing in my head, but it wasn't getting any easier. The morning in Lincoln Hills started off damp, with light rain pattering on the roofs, leaving puddles on the sidewalks and the smell of wet earth in the air. Amy Richardson stood at the kitchen window, watching the school bus take Jack and Sophie away. Their yellow raincoats flashed around the corner, and she returned to the table, where her coffee was already cooling. Tony left for the plant an hour ago, muttering something about long day, and leaving behind only a dirty dish in the sink. She sighed, rubbing her neck. Another day, another routine. There was a knock on the door. Amy frowned. Who could come so early? She wiped her hands on a towel and went to open it. Standing in the doorway was Dan Miller, a neighbor with a permanent grin and raindrops on his leather jacket. In his hands he held a white envelope, slightly wrinkled at the edges. "Good morning, Amy," he nodded, shaking water out of his hair. "Can't I interfere?" Dan, did something happen? She crossed her arms, not inviting him to enter. His visits were becoming too frequent, and she didn't like it. "No, I was just walking by," he shrugged, but something cunning flashed in his eyes. "Found this in my mailbox. It seems the postman got the addresses mixed up. It's yours." Amy took the envelope, frowning. There was no name or address on it, just white paper, slightly damp from the rain. "Thank you," she said, already about to close the door. "Open it, see what's there." Dan took a step closer, looking over her shoulder. Suddenly something important. She hesitated, but curiosity got the better of her. Amy tore the edge of the envelope and pulled out a photograph, colored, slightly blurry, obviously taken on a phone. The picture was of Tony, his broad shoulders and familiar blue jacket. He stood at the entrance to the Rusty Anchor, hugging some woman tall, with dark hair, whose face you couldn't make out. Tony's hands were on her waist, and she was laughing, throwing her head back. Amy froze, feeling the blood drain from her face. "What the?" she whispered, squeezing the photo in her hands. "Wow," Dan whistled, feigning surprise. "What is this, Tony? Seriously?" Amy looked at him sharply, her eyes narrowed. "Did you know what was there?" "Yes, I just bought it." He raised his hands as if in defense. "The postman must have made a mistake. I thought it was a bill or something." She didn't answer, looking at the photo. The blur made him suspicious, but Tony's figure was recognizable: his jacket, his posture. My heart started pounding, and there was a lump in my throat. Dan was still standing on the threshold, watching her with poorly hidden interest. Well, I'll go, he retreated, smiling at the corner of his lips. If anything, come in, let's chat. You look like you could use some company. Amy slammed the door without saying a word. She returned to the kitchen, throwing the photo on the table. Her hands shook as she poured herself more coffee, but the cup remained untouched. My thoughts were spinning like a carousel. Who is this woman? When was this? And why didn't Tony tell her? The day passed slowly. Amy was sitting in her office at school, but her work was not going well. She mixed up 2 calls from her parents, spilled coffee on the keyboard, and kept looking back to the bag where the photo was. By lunchtime, she couldn't stand it anymore. She asked the director for leave, citing a headache, and went home. Tony had to return from the factory by 6, and she decided to wait for him there. When he entered the house, shaking raindrops from his jacket, Amy was already sitting on the sofa. The photo lay in front of her on the coffee table, next to an empty mug. Tony threw the keys on the nightstand and froze, noticing her gaze sharp as a knife. "You're early," he nodded, taking off his shoes. "Where are the children?" "At the neighbor's," Amy answered coldly, not taking her eyes off him. "We need to talk." "About what?" Tony walked into the living room, rubbing his neck. He looked tired, but that didn't soften her. She silently moved the photo towards him. Tony frowned, took the photo, and squinted, trying to make out the details. His eyebrows rose, and then he snorted, throwing the photo back on the table. "What is this, a joke?" He looked at her, crossing his arms. "Where did you get this?" "In the mailbox." Amy stood up, her voice trembling with suppressed anger. "Who is she, Tony? And don't lie to me. What is she?" He raised his tone, throwing his jacket on the chair. "I have no idea what you're talking about. It's not even clear, Amy. Maybe it's not me at all." "Not you." She stepped towards him, pointing her finger at the photo. "This is your jacket, your hair, your bar. Do you think I'm blind?" "My bar?" Tony rolled his eyes. "I'm there with the guys, so what? This doesn't mean I'm hugging some women. Then explain where it came from." Amy almost screamed, her face turned red. "You come back late, you smell of beer, and now this. You're lying to me, Tony. Am I lying to you?" He slammed his fist on the table, and the mug jumped. "I work hard every day so that we don't fly out of this house, and here you are making a scene because of some blurry photo. Are you serious?" "Yes, seriously." She grabbed the photo and shook it in front of his face. "You don't tell me anything anymore. Where were you yesterday? Day before yesterday? I'm tired of guessing. I was at work, Amy." Tony stepped towards her, his voice getting louder. "And then, yes, I went to the bar and drank beer." "And what? Is this a crime? Is this woman also just beer?" She threw the photo on the floor, and it fell at his feet. Tony clenched his jaw, looking down at her. His breathing was heavy, and a mixture of anger and fatigue flashed in his eyes. "Don't you believe me? Great. Think what you want." He turned around, grabbed his jacket, and headed towards the door. Amy shouted after him, "Where are you going?" "To a place where they don't consider me a liar." He slammed the door so hard that the glass in the windows shook. Amy remained standing in the middle of the living room, looking at the closed door. Her heart was pounding and tears were burning in her eyes, but she held them back. She picked up the photo from the floor, peering again at the blurry outline. Maybe he's right. Maybe it's not him. But doubts gnawed at her like mice at old fabric, and she could not drive them away. Tony walked down the street, not noticing the rain that wet his hair and flowed down his collar. He turned into the rusty anchor, pushed open the door, and plopped down in his usual chair at the counter. Kate looked up from the glass she was wiping and nodded at him. "You're early today." She put the Budweiser in front of him. "What happened?" "Amy," Tony muttered, opening the bottle. "I found some photos, and I think that I'm having an affair with someone." "Seriously?" Kate raised an eyebrow. "And what kind of photo?" "Who the hell knows?" He waved his hand. "Blurred, stupid. I tell her it's not me, but she screams as if I'm cheating on her right on the couch." "Wives," Kate chuckled, returning to her glasses. Maybe someone set him up? Tony froze, looking at her. Framed? Why? Well, you never know, she shrugged. In your town, gossip spreads faster than the wind. He took a sip of his beer, thoughtful. But the thought of a setup quickly flew out of my head. It was too crazy. He just wanted to forget this scandal, at least for an hour. The bar was filling up, the jukebox was playing something from the Eagles, and Tony disappeared into the noise, pushing Amy and her accusations into the background. Meanwhile, Dan was sitting at home, looking at the rain outside the window. On the table lay the phone from which he took that photo, an old photo of Tony from the factory, where he hugged a colleague after a shift, plus a little Photoshop for verisimilitude. The grin never left his face. He knew Amy was in turmoil right now, and this was just the beginning. Evening in Lincoln Hills had fallen like a heavy gray blanket. The rain had stopped, but the dampness remained, permeating everything from the wooden porches to Amy Richardson's mood. She sat on the living room couch, staring at the blank TV screen that she hadn't even turned on. On the coffee table lay the same blurry photograph of Tony with the stranger, crumpled at the edges from the way she clutched it in her hands. After their argument that morning, Tony didn't come home for dinner, and the phone was silent, no call, no message. Only silence, interrupted by the creaking of an old house and the distant barking of a neighbor's dog. Amy rubbed her eyes, feeling fatigue and resentment tightening her chest. Jack and Sophie were visiting a neighbor, Mrs. Harris, who agreed to sit with them while Amy sorted things out. But there was no business, only emptiness and thoughts that swirled around Tony. She got up, walked around the room, then stopped at the window. The lights in Dan Miller's house were on, and for some reason it caught her attention. She shuddered at the memory of his grin, but a thought flashed through her head. Maybe I should talk to someone, at least with someone. She grabbed the phone, hesitated, but still texted Dan. Are you home? Can you come in for a minute? The answer came almost immediately. I'm already on my way. Amy threw the phone onto the sofa, feeling something clench inside her. She didn't trust Dan, but the loneliness was stronger. She just needed a voice to fill the silence. 5 minutes later, there was a knock on the door. Amy opened it, and Dan stood in the doorway, wearing the same leather jacket, holding a bottle of red wine and a smile that seemed both friendly and sly. Hi, Amy, he nodded, shaking drops of moisture from his hair. Here, I grabbed something. Thought you could use some relaxation. Oh, you didn't have to. She hesitated, stepping back to let him in. Come in, I guess. Dan walked into the living room, looking around with mild curiosity. Your place is cozy, he said, putting the bottle on the table next to the photograph. Tony hasn't returned yet? No, Amy pursed her lips, sitting down on the sofa. He left after an argument, probably at the bar again. Seriously, Dan whistled, sitting down in the chair opposite. Because of that photo? Yes, she nodded, looking at the photo. He says it's not him, but I don't know what to believe. Dan leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. Look, Amy, I don't want to pry into my own business, but if he reacts like that, maybe he has something to hide. You're not stupid, you can see for yourself. Maybe, she shrugged, looking away, but he swears that nothing like that happened. It's just, he's always somewhere, and I'm here alone. One, Dan repeated, shaking his head. This is wrong. You deserve better than to sit and wait for him to work his way up. Amy looked at him, surprised by his tone. What do you mean? Well, he spread his hands. You're beautiful, smart, you want a house, children. And him? Drink beer with some chicks and yell at you for asking. This is not the point. She was silent, digesting his words. She didn't like Dan, but now his sympathy was like a sip of water in the desert. She got up, walked to the kitchen, and returned with 2 glasses. Okay, open your wine. Maybe you're right, I need to relax. That's a conversation, Dan grinned, deftly uncorking the bottle with a corkscrew from his pocket. He poured the wine dark red, with the pungent smell of cheap supermarket Merlot. For you, Amy, so that you don't be sad because of all sorts of idiots. They clinked glasses, and Amy took a sip. The wine was tart but warm, and she drank more, feeling the tension in her shoulders release slightly. Dan looked at her, sipping his own, and the conversation flowed on. You know, he began, putting the glass on the table, if I were Tony, I would fly home after work. What is he? Hangs out at the bar. He doesn't appreciate you, Amy. Maybe he doesn't appreciate it, she sighed, twirling the glass in her hands. He was different before. He came, hugged, and asked how the day was. And now, just tired and don't start. You see, Dan nodded, moving a little closer. You give him everything, but he won't even say thank you. This is not life. Amy finished her glass and held it out for more. Pour some more. I don't want to think about it. As you say, he smiled, filling her glass to the brim. But I'm serious, Amy. You're too good for that. She drank more, feeling the warmth spreading through her body. My head felt a little dizzy, but it was better than emptiness. Dan continued to talk about how tired he was of being alone, how he noticed how strong she was, how Tony didn't understand what he was losing. His voice sounded soft, almost affectionate, and Amy, without noticing it, began to relax. Do you really think so? She asked, looking at him with eyes clouded from wine. What am I? Good? Really? Dan moved closer. Now their knees were almost touching. I've been seeing this for a long time. You just don't give yourself a chance to understand it. He placed his hand on her shoulder, squeezing lightly. Amy tensed, but did not move away. The wine had dulled her usual wariness. Dan, I don't know, she muttered, but he was already leaning closer. It's okay, he lowered his voice, stroking her shoulder. You're just tired. Let me help. His hand slid lower, hugging her waist. Amy froze, her breathing ragged. She wanted to say no, to push him away, but her body seemed numb from wine and fatigue. Dan pulled her towards him, hugging her tighter, and she didn't resist. She just closed her eyes, letting him comfort her in a way Tony hadn't done in a long time. That's it, he whispered, his lips near her ear. You shouldn't be alone. His hand rose higher, sliding to her chest. Amy shuddered as he began to touch her, carefully at first, then more boldly. Her mind screamed stop, but her voice was stuck in her throat. She felt his fingers through the fabric of her sweater, and it was both alien and strangely attractive, as if someone had finally noticed her, albeit in the wrong way. Dan, she squeezed out, but he just smiled and continued. Hush, Amy. He leaned even closer, his breath burning her neck. I see how hard it is for you. She sat frozen as the wine and his words confused her thoughts. It was wrong, she knew, but at that moment she just wanted someone to be there, even if it was Dan. The night in Lincoln Hills was cold and damp, with a light fog that drifted along the streets, reflecting the streetlights in hazy patches. Tony Richardson walked home from the Rusty Anchor, swaying slightly, 3 bottles of Budweiser still buzzing in his head, but not so much that he couldn't think straight. His old Ford was left in the bar's parking lot. He decided to walk, hoping that the fresh air would erase the irritation after the morning scandal with Amy. Hands in his jacket pockets, collar raised, he looked like a man who wanted to hide from the whole world. Halfway through, he slapped his forehead, remembering that he had left his phone on the kitchen table. Damn, he muttered, turning around. Amy was probably already asleep, but without his phone, he felt naked. What if the factory needed something urgently in the morning? He quickened his pace, cursing his forgetfulness, and 10 minutes later, he was climbing the creaky steps of the porch of their house. The light in the living room was on, which was strange. Usually by 11, Amy turned off everything except the night light in the hallway. Tony frowned as he inserted the key into the lock. The door opened with a quiet click, and he stepped inside, shaking the mist from his hair. At first he heard voices, low, male, and soft, female. His heart skipped a beat. He quietly closed the door and walked through the corridor, looking into the living room. The picture that opened before him hit him like a hammer to the temple. Amy sat on the sofa, her blonde hair disheveled, her eyes sparkling with wine. Nearby, almost right next to him, sat Dan Miller, a neighbor whom Tony tolerated only because he lived 2 houses away. Dan's shirt was unbuttoned halfway, exposing his chest with sparse hair, and he whispered something in Amy's ear, one arm wrapped around her waist. The other one was reaching for her jacket. His fingers were already sliding along the fabric. Tony froze as if time had stopped. His brain tried to comprehend what he had seen, but his blood had already boiled, drowning out everything rational. "What the hell?" he burst out, his voice hoarse and loud, like the roar of a motor. Amy flinched, turning her head sharply. Her face turned pale and her eyes widened. "Tony!" She jumped up, almost knocking over the empty glass on the table. "It's not what you think." Dan also turned around, but his grin did not disappear, it only became a little wider, like that of a cat who had caught a mouse. "Oh, Tony, hi." He raised his hands as if in surrender, but there was a hint of mockery in his voice. "We were just chatting here." "Were you chatting?" Tony stepped forward, clenching his fists until his knuckles turned white. "Are you chatting with my wife with your shirt unbuttoned?" "Tony, listen." Amy stood between them, her voice trembling. "Nothing happened, I swear. I just... Just what?" he barked, looking down at her. "Just drinking wine with this freak while he gropes you." "I didn't paw." Dan stood up, buttoning his ribbon shirt. "Calm down, man. You got it all wrong." This was the last straw. Tony pushed Amy aside not roughly, but harshly, and lunged at Dan. His fist connected with his neighbor's jaw with a thud, and Dan flew back, hitting the back of the chair. "Didn't you understand?" Tony grabbed him by the collar, lifting him up. "I'll understand you so well now that you'll forget how to walk." "Tony, stop!" Amy screamed, clinging to his hand. "Nothing happened, please." But he didn't hear. Fury clouded my eyes with a red veil. He hit Dan again in the nose, and he crunched, splashing blood onto the carpet. Dan growled, trying to fight back, but Tony was bigger and meaner. He threw him to the floor, straddled him on top, and began to hammer with his fists in the face, in the chest, wherever it hit. "You are in my house, with my wife." Each blow was accompanied by a growl, like a beast breaking out of a cage. "Tony, that's enough." Amy grabbed his shoulders, trying to pull him away. "You will kill him." "There was nothing, I swear." Dan wheezed beneath him, covering his face with his hands, but Tony didn't stop. Blood flowed from the neighbor's broken nose, staining his shirt and floor. Finally, he grabbed Dan by the jacket, yanked him up, and threw him towards the door. "Get out of here," he yelled, kicking him in the back. "And so that I don't see you again." Dan staggered out onto the porch, tripped over the step, and fell into the dirt. He cursed, holding his face, but Tony had already turned to Amy. Her eyes were full of tears, her hands were shaking, but he did not let her speak. "And you too!" He pointed a finger in her direction, breathing heavily. "Get out of my house." "Tony, please listen." She stepped towards him, her voice breaking. "I didn't want to, it was him. I drank, I was upset because of you. There was nothing. Upset with me." He snorted, wiping the blood from his knuckles on his jeans. "What is this, consolation? With this bastard? Get out." "Tony, I swear." She grabbed his sleeve, but he pulled his hand away, pushing her towards the door. "I said, get out." His voice thundered so loudly that the glass shook. Amy staggered, clutching the doorframe, but he had already turned around, not looking at her. She ran out the door, sobbing, and stood on the porch next to Dan, who was still sitting in the dirt, holding his nose. You ruined everything," she managed, looking at him through her tears. "Come on, he's crazy himself." Dan spat out blood, grinning crookedly. "Come to me, you can wait it out." "No," she shook her head, retreating. "Leave me alone." Tony stood in the living room, looking at the overturned chair, spilled wine and blood stains on the carpet. His chest heaved, his fists still clenched. He heard Amy screaming outside, but the words didn't come through. All he could see was Dan unbuttoning his shirt and Amy not pushing him away. He collapsed on the sofa, covering his face with his hands, and cursed into the void. Morning arrived in Lincoln Hills with a heavy, humid air filled with the smell of damp and gasoline. Fog crept along the streets, clinging to bare tree branches and rusty fences, as if the city was trying to hide from itself. The Richardson house was quiet except for the ticking of the wall clock in the living room and the creaking of the floor under Tony's feet. He sat on the sofa, staring at the blood stains on the carpet dark, already dried, like traces of yesterday's nightmare. His right hand, swollen and bruised, rested on his knee, but he felt no pain, only emptiness mixed with the remnants of the anger that still smoldered inside. Amy didn't come home after he kicked her and Dan out, and he didn't know where she was. Maybe from a neighbor, maybe from a friend, he didn't care. He didn't sleep all night, just sat staring into the darkness until the first rays of light broke through the curtains. There was a noise outside, a car door slammed and footsteps were heard. Tony raised his head when there was a sharp, demanding knock on the door. He stood up, rubbing his neck, and went to open it. Two uniformed policemen stood on the threshold. One older, with gray hair at the temples and tired eyes, kept his hand on his holster. The second, younger one, with short hair and a notepad in his hands, looked at Tony with slight tension. "Tony Richardson?" asked the elder. His voice was even but firm. "Yes," Tony frowned, feeling how everything inside was shrinking. "What's the matter?" "We have a report of an attack." The policeman nodded towards Dan's house 2 sections away. "Dan Miller claims you beat him up last night. We need you to come with us." Statement. Tony froze, his eyebrows went up. "This bastard asked for it himself. He was in my house, with my wife. We'll figure it out," said the younger one, making a note in his notebook. "But now you need to come with us. Please, no resistance." Tony clenched his fists as he looked at them. His first instinct was to yell and kick them out, but he knew that would only make things worse. "Okay," he muttered, grabbing the jacket from the hanger. "But it was he who came to me, and not I to him." The police looked at each other, but said nothing. They took him out onto the street, where a patrol car was already parked with blue lights flashing. The neighbors, Mrs. Ways Harris and Old Man Johnson with a lawnmower, looked out of their windows, watching Tony get into the back seat. The door slammed and the car drove off, leaving behind only whispers of gossip that were already beginning to spread throughout Lincoln Hills. At this time, Dan Miller was lying in the ward of a local hospital 10 miles from the town. His nose was wrapped in bandages, his face was swollen, and there were dark bruises under his eyes. He looked pitiful, but a smirk still curled his lips as he dictated a statement to the nurse who was sitting next to the tablet. "Write that he attacked for no reason," Dan spoke hoarsely, wincing in pain. "I just went to their house to chat with Amy, and he burst in and started beating me. My nose was broken, my ribs were bruised, all without warning. Are you sure you want to apply?" The nurse, a young girl with a tired look, raised an eyebrow. "This is a serious accusation." "I'm sure," Dan nodded, rubbing his jaw. "This psycho has to answer. I sat peacefully, and he almost killed me." The nurse sighed, but continued typing. An hour later, the application was ready, and a copy was sent to the police station. Dan leaned back on the pillow, looking at the ceiling. His plan was falling apart at the seams. He didn't expect Tony to fall apart like that, but now he could at least win back. "Let's see who's smarter here," he thought, closing his eyes. Amy returned home around noon, picking up Jack and Sophie from Mrs. Harris. She looked like a shadow. Her hair was disheveled. There were circles under her eyes. Her jacket still smelled of wine from yesterday. The children ran to their rooms, not noticing her condition, and she stopped in the living room, looking at the overturned chair and blood stains. She was shaking. She did not sleep, spending the night with her friend Lisa, who gave her a sofa and a cup of tea, but did not ask too much. Now, standing in her house, Amy felt how everything was collapsing. "Mom, where is Dad?" Jack leaned out of the corridor, holding a typewriter in his hands. "He's at work," she lied, forcing herself to smile. "Go play, okay?" Jack shrugged and ran away, and Amy collapsed on the couch, covering her face with her hands. How did it come to this? Just yesterday, she just wanted to talk to Tony, and now he's out there somewhere, probably furious, and Dan. She remembered his hands, his whisper, and she shuddered. She didn't want this, didn't plan it, but the wine and resentment did their job. And Tony, he didn't even let her explain. The phone rang, and she jumped. The number was unfamiliar. "Hello?" Her voice trembled. "Mrs. Richardson." The male voice on the other end was dry and official. "This is Officer Bradley from the station. Your husband, Tony, is with us. He was arrested for assaulting Dan Miller. You need to come." "Arrested?" Amy almost dropped the phone. "How? For what?" "Mr. Miller filed a statement." The officer spoke calmly, as if it was a routine matter. "Come if you want to see him." She hung up, feeling tears sting her eyes. Children, home, Tony in prison, everything was mixed up in my head. She called Lisa, asked to babysit Jack and Sophie again, and drove to the station in an old Honda that barely started. The station was cold and smelled of coffee and disinfection. Tony sat behind the glass in the interrogation room, looking at the floor. His hands were handcuffed and his jacket was wrinkled. Amy stepped closer, her heart pounding. "Tony," she pressed her palm against the glass. "What's happening?" He looked up, and there was a mixture of anger and fatigue in his eyes. "What's happening?" "Your friend filed a report against me, that's what. I've been arrested, Amy." "I didn't want this." She shook her head, tears running down her cheeks. I tried to explain. "Explain?" He snorted, leaning back in his chair. "You sat with him while he groped you. What is there to explain?" "Nothing happened, Tony." Her voice broke. "I swear, I just—" "That's enough," he interrupted, looking away. "Just leave." The officer approached her, gently touching her shoulder. "Ma'am, you better wait outside. We'll figure it out." Amy staggered out and sat down on a bench in the hallway. Her world was falling apart, and she didn't know how to put it back together. Dan spent the day in the hospital enjoying playing the victim. His nose was broken, a couple of ribs were bruised, but he was already making plans to make the most of it. The application was submitted, and he knew that Tony was now in trouble. "Let him sit," he thought, rubbing his chin. Amy, of course, is off the hook, but he will still find a way to regain her trust. Meanwhile, the trial moved quickly. 2 weeks later, Tony appeared before a judge in Lincoln Hills District Court. The hall was small, with worn wooden benches and the smell of old paper. Tony's state-appointed lawyer tried to prove that it was self-defense, but Dan's testimony and traces of blood in the house played against it. Amy sat in the courtroom, biting her lips, while the judge read out the verdict. "Tony Richardson, for causing grievous bodily harm, you are sentenced to 3 years in prison." The judge's voice was as dry as autumn leaves. "The sentence comes into force immediately." Tony lowered his head, not looking at Amy. He was taken away in handcuffs, and she remained sitting, feeling tears dripping onto her concurrent ashmapins. Jack and Sophie were waiting at home, and she had to explain why Dad wouldn't be coming back in the evening. Amy returned to an empty house, where everything reminded her of Tony, his jacket on the hanger, his mug in the sink. She put the children to bed and sat in the kitchen, looking at the phone. How did it get this far? She blamed herself, Dan, Tony, everyone in turn. But there was no answer, only silence and 3 years ahead. Tony Richardson sat on a narrow cot in his cell, a gray concrete box with peeling paint, a small barred window that barely let in dim light, and a rusty toilet in the corner. His blue uniform was wrinkled, his hair was disheveled, and there were dark circles under his eyes, traces of sleepless nights and endless thoughts. It had been a week since the judge had handed down the sentence. 3 years for beating Dan Miller, and Tony was still getting used to this place. The silence here was deceptive, interrupted by the clanging of doors, the screams of prisoners, and the footsteps of guards somewhere in the corridor. He sat with his head down and looked at his hands, large, calloused, with healing abrasions from the night when everything collapsed. In the factory, these hands turned bolts, fixed cars, held beer at the rusty anchor, and now they were simply useless, lying on my lap like strangers. The days in prison passed slowly, like an old truck on a broken road. In the morning, getting up at 6 to a sharp bell, then breakfast, watery oatmeal with a piece of bread that looked more like cardboard. Then an hour in the yard, where he walked in circles under the barbed wire, looking at the gray sky and occasionally exchanging a few words with other prisoners. The rest of the time in the cell, alone with yourself. Tony never liked to delve into the past, but there was no choice. Thoughts entered his head like uninvited guests. Hey, Richardson, the voice of his cellmate, a skinny guy named Mike, pulled him out of his thoughts. Mike sat on the top bunk, leafing through a tattered book without a cover, something about detectives, judging by the scraps of text. You are silent again. Why so gloomy? I think, Tony muttered, without looking up. His voice was hoarse, as if he hadn't spoken in a week, even though he and Mike had chatted yesterday. About what? Mike jumped down, landing with a light thud on the concrete floor. He was a petty thief, brought here for stealing beer from a store, and liked to talk to pass the time. About your grandmother, right? Tony clenched his jaw, but nodded. About her, and about how I ended up here. Tell me. Mike sat down next to him, crossing his legs, like a schoolboy in class. There's nothing to do anyway until lunch arrives. Tony sighed, rubbing his neck. He didn't want to speak, but the words came out on their own, maybe out of boredom, or maybe because it became unbearable to keep everything inside. I found her with a neighbor. That bastard, Dan, was sitting in my house with his shirt unbuttoned, groping her. I lost my temper and beat him until he bled. And now I've been sitting here for 3 years. Hard, Mike whistled, shaking his head. Did she cheat on you? I don't know, Tony shrugged, looking at the wall where someone had scratched a crooked star. She swore that there was no, screamed that nothing happened. But I didn't listen. I saw them and exploded. I understand, Mike nodded, scratching his chin. I would have broken my head too if I had caught mine like that. But 3 years is not a piece of cake for you. Why so harsh? He applied, Tony snorted, leaning back on the bed. His back rested against a hard mattress that smelled of mold. He said that I attacked for no reason. The judge believed him, not me. That's it. Bastard, Mike chuckled. Didn't you think that she really wasn't to blame? Maybe this Dan set her up. Tony froze, looking at him. The thought flashed like a spark, but he immediately extinguished it. Framed? Why? She let him in herself, sat with him, and drank wine. I saw it with my own eyes. Well, I saw it, Mike shrugged. What if he got her drunk, or something else? Women are sometimes stupid when they are upset. Tony remained silent, but Mike's words stuck in his head. He remembered Amy, her tears, her screams. Nothing happened, Tony, I swear. He had not listened then, too blinded by anger, but now, in this gray cage, doubts began to gnaw at him. What if she was telling the truth? What if he lost his temper in vain? He closed his eyes, rubbing his temples. His life, 9 years of marriage, 2 children, work at a factory, all this now seemed distant, like a dream. And anger, which has always been his companion, also brought him here. How many times did he yell at Amy about money, slam the door, go to the bar? How many times have you not listened to her when she tried to say something? Maybe it's not only Dan's fault, but himself. You're right, he finally said, looking at Mike. I lost my temper. But what now? 3 years here, and she is there, with the children, alone. Write to her, Mike pointed his finger in the air. We can have letters once a week. Tell me what you think. Maybe she'll answer. Tony nodded but didn't answer. He didn't know what to write. Apologize, blame, or just remain silent as always. His thoughts were confused, but for the first time in a week, he felt something other than anger, a shadow of regret, thin as a spider's web. Meanwhile, in Lincoln Hills, Amy sat in the kitchen of her home, staring at her empty coffee mug. Jack and Sophie were at school, and the silence pressed on her like a concrete slab. It had been a week since Tony had been taken away in handcuffs, and she still couldn't come to her senses. Her life turned into chaos. The children asked where Dad was, the bank sent letters about the mortgage, and she herself could barely contain herself so as not to burst into tears every time she looked at his jacket that was hanging in the corridor. She blamed herself for that night with Dan, for the wine, for not stopping him right away. But most of all, she blamed herself for not being able to explain to Tony. The doorbell knocked her out of her thoughts. Amy stood up, straightened her stretched sweater, and went to open it. Lisa, her friend from school, stood on the threshold with a package from Walmart in her hands. Lisa was short, with short red hair and a perpetual smile that now looked rather sympathetic. "Hi, Amy." Lisa stepped inside without waiting for an invitation. "Brought you something. How are you holding up?" "I'm trying," Amy smiled weakly, closing the door. "Come in. Do you want some coffee?" "Come on," Lisa nodded, putting the bag on the table. "But first tell me, how are you? You look like you haven't slept in a week." "It is," Amy sighed, turning on the coffee maker. "Tony's in jail. The kids don't understand what's going on, and I don't even know where to start." Lisa sat down at the table, looking at her with concern. "Listen, I learned something here. About that photo that you quarreled about." Amy froze, holding the mug in her hands. "What photo?" "The one where Tony is supposedly with some woman." Lisa lowered her voice, as if she was afraid that they would be overheard. "I saw Carrie yesterday. She works at a photo studio on Main Street. She said Dan came to see her a couple of weeks ago and asked her to fix an old photo. Something about the factory where Tony and his colleagues were. Carrie says he put a woman in there photoshopped Amy. It's a fake copy." Amy slowly sank into the chair, her face turning pale. "Fake? Are you serious?" "Seriously," Lisa nodded. "Carrie didn't want to talk, but I persuaded her. Dan set you up, Amy. He deliberately planted this photo on you so that you and Tony would quarrel." Amy closed her eyes, feeling tears burning her eyelids. She remembered that day, the envelope, the blurry photograph, her screams at Tony. It all started from this. "Oh my God," she whispered, clutching the mug. "I didn't believe him. He said that it was not him, but me. I caused a scandal." "You didn't know." Lisa put her hand on her shoulder. "Dan is a bastard. It's his doing. But now you know the truth. What should I do?" Amy looked at her, her voice trembling. "Tony is in prison, Lisa. Because of me, because I let Dan in, because of all of this. Write to him." Lisa squeezed her hand. "Tell me everything. He should know." Amy nodded, but everything was shrinking inside. She got up, poured some coffee, but didn't drink it. She just watched the steam rise from the mug. The truth about the photo was like a knife in the heart. It destroyed their marriage, and now Tony was paying for it with 3 years of his life. That night, Amy sat at the kitchen table with a piece of paper and a pen in front of her. Jack and Sophie were upstairs asleep. The house was silent, except for the hum of the old coffee maker. She took the pen, but her fingers trembled. What to write? How to explain? She started slowly, drawing out each word with difficulty. "Tony, I don't know where to start. Probably because I'm ashamed. I found out today that that photo, the one we fought over, was a fake. Dan set me up, corrected an old photo from the factory, and added a woman to it. I didn't know, I swear. I thought you were lying to me, and everything went wrong. And then that night, I didn't want it to happen. Dan came over, I was upset, I drank wine, and he took advantage of it. But I didn't cheat on you, Tony, I swear with everything I have. You caught us, and I don't blame you for losing your temper. It's my own fault for letting him in. I'm not asking you to forgive me right now. I know you are in prison because of this, and I have no forgiveness. But I want you to know the truth. I love you, Tony. I always have. Jack and Sophie ask about you every day, and I don't know what to tell them. I'll wait for you, I swear. 3 years is a long time, but I will be here with the children, and we will wait for you to come home. Forgive me if you can. Write if you want. I'll be waiting. Now." She reread the letter, tears dripping onto the paper, smearing the ink. Then she folded the sheet, put it in an envelope, and wrote the address of the prison that she was given at the station. Lincoln Hills County Jail has become a strange home for Tony Richardson over the past 2 years and 4 months. The gray walls, the clanging of metal doors, the smell of cheap soap and oatmeal, all this ingrained itself into him like oil into his work jacket from the factory. But today was a different day. The morning began with the guard, a big guy named Roy, tapping his baton on the bars of his cell and muttering, "Richardson, get ready. You're leaving." Tony froze, sitting on his bed with a worn book in his hands, some old western that Mike gave him. He didn't immediately understand what it was about. So, he asked, looking up. How is this? Good behavior, Roy shrugged, opening the door. Ahead of schedule. 8 months have been knocked off you. Come on, get moving before you change your mind. Tony stood up slowly, feeling his heart pound. 2 years and 4 months instead of 3, it was unexpected. He didn't fight, didn't argue with the guards, helped in the laundry, and was silent more than he spoke. Apparently this worked. Mike, his cellmate, had already gotten away a couple of months ago for petty theft, so there was no one to say goodbye to. Tony gathered his things, a stack of letters from Amy, a worn-out photograph of Jack and Sophie that she had sent for Christmas, and a couple of books. Everything fits into a small plastic bag. Letters from Amy arrived regularly once a week, sometimes more often. At first he didn't answer. He was too angry, too confused in his thoughts after her first letter of apology. But she didn't stop. I wrote about Jack, how he won a prize at a school fair for a homemade car. About Sophie, how she learned a song about the alphabet and sang it all day. To herself, how hard it is without him, how she goes to work at school, pays the mortgage, and holds on for the sake of the children. Each letter ended with the same thing. I'll wait for you, Tony. We're all waiting. Over time, he began to answer briefly, awkwardly, but still wrote. Tell Jack I'm proud. Let Sophie sing louder. Hang in there, Amy. It was not forgiveness, but the beginning of something new. Now he stood outside the prison, wearing the old blue jacket that Amy had brought him before his release, and jeans that were slightly tight. He had lost weight in prison. The morning sun blinded my eyes. The air smelled of freedom grass, gasoline, distant smoke from someone's fire. Tony took a deep breath, feeling his lungs expand after 2 years of stale prison air. He didn't know what to expect, but in the last letter Amy wrote, I will be there when you come out. We all will be. And then he saw them. Amy stood in the parking lot next to the old Honda. Her blonde hair was pulled back into a ponytail, and she was wearing the same gray sweater with the school logo that he remembered, only a little worn. Next to him is Jack, now 10 years old, with disheveled brown hair and a Spider-Man backpack that is already completely worn out. And Sophie, 7 years old, in a pink dress and pigtails, held a homemade sign. Welcome home, Dad. They stood looking at him, and Tony felt his throat tighten. Tony. Amy stepped forward, her voice trembling. She stopped a couple of meters away, as if not knowing whether to hug him or not. You earlier. Yes, he nodded, squeezing the package in his hands. Good behavior. They said 8 months minus. Dad. Sophie rushed to him, clasping his legs with her thin arms. You're back. I drew a poster for you, look. Tony got down on one knee, looking at her. Her eyes sparkled, and for the first time in a long time he smiled not forcedly, but sincerely. Cool poster, baby, he said, patting her on the head. Well done. Jack approached more slowly, keeping his hands in his pockets. Hi, Dad, he muttered, but there was something warm in his voice. Are you home now? Home now, Tony nodded, looking at his son. How are your cars? Still building. Yeah, Jack smiled slightly. I made one with a motor. I'll show you. Amy stood a little to the side, biting her lip. She looked at Tony, and in her eyes there was everything guilt, hope, fatigue. I'm glad you're here, she finally said, her voice quiet but firm. We are all happy. Tony stood up, looking at her. 2 years ago, he kicked her out of the house without listening, blinded by anger. Then her letters, dozens, hundreds of lines, slowly melted this ice. He didn't know if he had forgiven her completely, but now, looking at her and the children, he knew he wanted to try. I'm glad, too, he said, stepping closer. Thank you for writing. It kept me going. She nodded, wiping a tear from her cheek. I promised to wait, and we waited. They stood there for several seconds, not knowing what to do next. Then Sophie pulled Tony's hand. Let's go home, Dad. I drew you a pie. Well, not real, but on paper, but still. Pie on paper. Tony chuckled, looking at Amy. This is something new. She was training. Amy smiled faintly, opening the car door. Sit down. Let's go. Homemade mac and cheese, your favorite. Tony sat in the front seat and Jack and Sophie climbed into the back, chatting about school and friends. The car started moving, and he looked out the window at the familiar streets of Lincoln Hills, rusty pickup trucks, peeling signs, trees without leaves. Everything was the same, but different. He was different. 2 years in prison, Amy's letters, her voice and every word, it changed him. He didn't know what would happen next, but now, with the kids in the back and Amy by his side, he felt like they had a chance. Amy held the steering wheel, giving him short glances. "Are you okay?" she asked quietly as Sophie sang something about the alphabet. "Yes," Tony nodded, looking at her. "And you?" "Now, yes," she pursed her lips, but a spark flashed in her eyes. "You're home, Tony. This is the main thing." He said nothing, but put his hand on her knee, a light, careful touch. She didn't pull away, and this was the first step towards something new. The morning in the Richardson house began with the usual chaos. Jack was rushing around the kitchen, trying to stuff his math book into his backpack, while Sophie sat at the table, spreading jam on toast and humming something inaudible. Amy stood at the stove, turning over scrambled eggs, her blonde hair pulled back into a loose ponytail and signs of fatigue still visible under her eyes. Tony, who had returned home a week ago, sat at the table with a mug of coffee, looking at this fuss. His blue jacket hung over the back of the chair, and his hands, still calloused from the factory, but now clean, lay on the table. He was at home, but he felt a little alien, like a guest who does not yet know where he belongs. "Jack, have you forgotten your notebook again?" Amy glanced over her shoulder. Her voice was even, but with a hint of irritation. "It's on the sofa. Go get it." I took it. Jack rolled his eyes, but still ran into the living room, sneakers slapping on the linoleum. "And I drew a car for Dad." Sophie proudly held up the piece of paper, covered in red and blue scribbles. "It's a Ford like yours, Dad." Tony smiled as he took the drawing. "Cool, baby. Maybe I should make one like this at the factory." "Yes." Sophie giggled, and Amy placed a plate of scrambled eggs in front of him. "Eat it while it's hot," she said, without looking him in the eye. "Do you have to work today?" "No, I took the day off." Tony sipped his coffee, looking at her. "I thought maybe we'd go somewhere." "All together." Amy froze, holding the frying pan. "Where?" "I don't know," he shrugged. "To the park, or something. Or that psychologist you were talking about." She turned slowly, her eyebrows raised. "Are you serious? I thought you were against it." "I was against it," Tony nodded, picking at the scrambled eggs with a fork. "But maybe it's not so stupid. At least for the sake of the children." Amy pursed her lips, but there was a spark of hope in her eyes. After his return, they lived as if on thin ice. They talked about everyday life, about Jack and Sophie, but avoided everything else. Tension hung in the air, like the smell of rain before a thunderstorm. She blamed herself for that night with Dan. He was still angry, although he didn't show it. Letters from prison brought them closer, but did not erase the rift. The idea of a psychologist came to her mind a couple of days ago, when Lisa mentioned some Dr. Miller in a neighboring town. Amy suggested this to Tony, but he then just snorted, "I won't pour out my soul to some bespectacled guy." Now he brought up the topic himself, and it was unexpected. "Okay," she nodded, putting the frying pan in the sink. "I'll call and sign us up. Are 2 today okay?" "Yes," Tony finished his coffee, looking at her. "Just without children, okay? Let them stay with Lisa." "Agreed." Amy wiped her hands on a towel, and for a moment their gazes met, cautious, but warm. Dr. Miller's office was a half-hour drive from Lincoln Hills, in a small brick building with a sign that said Family Therapy. The inside smelled of lavender from the aroma diffuser, and the walls were covered with diplomas and paintings with abstract stains. Dr. Miller, a short man in his 50s with a neat beard and a sweater, greeted them with a smile and a handshake. His desk was littered with papers, but in the corner there was a box of toys apparently for the children who came with their parents. "Tony, Amy, good to see you." He pointed to 2 chairs opposite him. "Take a seat. Tell us what brought you here." Tony sat with his arms crossed, his knee twitching nervously. Amy sat next to her, clutching her purse in her lap. She glanced at Tony, but he was looking at the floor. Well, Amy began first, her voice quiet but firm. It was hard for us. Tony just returned, and we're trying to get things back on track. For the sake of the children. Back? Dr. Miller raised an eyebrow, making a note in his notebook. Where, if it's not a secret? From prison, Tony muttered, finally looking up. 2 years and 4 months. Attack. I see, Miller nodded, without condemnation. And what happened before that? Amy swallowed, looking at her hands. We quarreled. I thought he was cheating on me because of the fake photo they planted on me. Then I let my neighbor home, had a drink with him, and Tony caught us. He beat him up and everything went downhill. Fake photo. The doctor looked at her. Who planted it? Neighbor Dan. Amy squeezed her purse tighter. He set me up. I found out later, but it was too late. Tony snorted, leaning back in his chair. It's late, yes. I almost killed him, and now I'm sitting here. Are you mad at her for this? Miller turned to him, his tone calm but direct. I was angry, Tony shrugged, looking to the side. I was angry for 2 years. She wrote to me, swore that nothing had happened, but I saw what I saw. You can't throw it away. And now? The doctor leaned forward. How do you feel? Tony fell silent, rubbing his neck. Don't know. She was waiting for me, holding her family. I want to believe her, but it's still here. He pointed a finger at his chest. Amy looked at him, her eyes sparkling. I don't blame you, Tony. It's my own fault. But I want us to succeed. For Jack and Sophie. And you, Amy? Miller turned to her. How do you feel about Tony? I love him, she said quietly but firmly. I always loved it. But I'm afraid that he doesn't trust me, and I don't know how to fix it. The doctor nodded, making another note. Fine. You both want to start again, that's a step. But trust is work. Tony, what do you need from Amy to trust her? Tony frowned at his boots. Honesty, probably, so that she speaks what she thinks, and not remain silent as before. And no more Dans. I promise, Amy nodded quickly, her voice trembling. None. I don't even look in his direction. What about you, Amy? Miller looked at her. What do you need from Tony? So that he can talk to me, she pursed her lips. He didn't go to the bar, he didn't remain silent. I want to know what's in his head. Tony nodded, albeit reluctantly. Okay, I will try. The session lasted an hour. They talked about the past, about how silence and anger had accumulated over the years, about that night that broke everything. Tension was in the air. Tony clenched his fists when he remembered Dan. Amy fidgeted with her purse when it came to her wine. But they tried. The doctor gave them an assignment to talk every day for at least 5 minutes about something important, not about everyday life. Start small, he said, walking them to the door. Damp autumn covered the Lincoln Hills with a thick layer of clouds. Water dripped from the trees, puddles spread along the roadsides, and it seemed as if the sun had completely forgotten the way to this town. The Richardson house was also in twilight. Amy tried to turn on the lights less often to save on bills, and Tony simply didn't like bright lighting after prison. He said it hurt his eyes. He was sitting in the living room, hunched over a stack of bills and receipts scattered on the coffee table. Amy stood at the window, watching Jack and Sophie play in the yard. The children were fussing around the old flower bed, creating rivers of rainwater. Their voices echoed in the silence of the room. Once upon a time, such a sound, a child's laughter, filled Tony with warmth. Now he felt only anxiety. The bills were growing, there was not enough money, work at the plant was not yet burning with the desire to return him to his old place. He thought about working as a mechanic at a local service station, but even there they paid a pittance. Listen, he finally spoke, without taking his eyes off the papers. We're in arrears on our mortgage again. I called the bank, they want us. Tony, I know, Amy interrupted him, biting her lip. I spoke to them last week. There is a delay for now, but it won't last long. Well, let's talk normally. He looked up, and irritation flashed in his eyes. You are silent about the fact that we have a debt, and here I am trying to put together the numbers. Maybe I should go back to the factory at night and still work during the day, so that you all don't end up on the street. Amy sighed heavily, turning away from the window. I'm silent because I'm afraid you'll explode. Like then. These words hung in the air. The phrase, like then, immediately transported both of them to the very night when Tony saw her with Dan. He fell silent, clenching his fists under the table. I won't explode if you're honest with me, he said finally, trying to speak more quietly. And maybe stop remembering that night every time we talk. Enough? Amy smiled bitterly. Tony, she's in my head. I can't erase this from my memory. And you yourself, admit it, can't. He stood up, throwing away his pencil. So what now? Every time I start talking about money, will you remember Dan? I don't remember Dan. There were tears in her voice. What I'm saying is that we are walking in a vicious circle. I'm afraid to tell you something because you might lose your temper. And you don't trust me because I saw how the neighbor puts his hands on you. He barked, choking on his own emotions. And yes, he set you up. But if you hadn't opened the door for him, nothing would have happened. They stood opposite each other in the dimly lit living room, breathing heavily, as if after a race. Amy sobbed and looked down. Maybe we really should live separately, Tony. These words sounded like a cold blade, cutting through the silence. Tony clenched his jaw, looking at his wife. Her eyes were red, her hands were shaking, but she was serious when she said it. Are you serious? He whispered. I don't know. She covered her face with her hands. But I want to understand if I can live without feeling guilty every second. And you apparently can't forget either. The children's laughter died down outside the window. Either Jack and Sophie heard screams or were simply tired of playing. Tony felt a cold creep into his chest. He hated this situation, hated that he couldn't deal with his feelings. It seemed as if a wall was rising between them again, even stronger than before. And where will you go? He asked hoarsely. To Lisa. Amy removed her hands. Her eyes were full of tears, but her voice sounded firm. She said that if you need it, she has a spare room. And I'll take the children with me, of course. Children? He felt a blow to the gut. Amy, they almost went crazy while I was in prison. Don't scream, she whispered, hugging herself by the shoulders. I don't want to ruin the family, I'm just asking for time. Suddenly, we will really understand what we want from each other. Tony didn't answer. There was a pounding in my head. Are I going to be left without a family again? He was afraid that this separation would be the last point. A day later, Amy packed a small suitcase and a couple of bags with baby clothes, trying not to look Tony in the eyes. Jack and Sophie, sensing the atmosphere, did not ask unnecessary questions. They only understood that Mom and Dad are quarreling again. When the door slammed, Tony was left alone in an empty house. He went into Jack's room and sat down on the edge of the bed, where there was a ball and a stack of comics. The usually noisy house now seemed too quiet. Week after week stretched like sticky mud after rain. Tony got a part-time job at a service station, changing oil, repairing carburetors, and sometimes tinkering with gearboxes. There was barely enough money for a mortgage and food. In the evenings, he sometimes went to the bar, but did not sit there until nightfall. He simply took a bottle of beer and silently stared into space, trying not to think about Dan, Amy, and the children. Amy settled in with Lisa. The children went to the same school as before. Lisa lived only a few blocks away. Sometimes Amy would come over to check on their lessons or take them to clubs, and meet Tony their awkward scenes when they exchanged words just for the sake of the children. What time is Jack's practice? Don't forget to return Sophie's library book. It was felt that there was an invisible spring stretched between them, which was ready to burst with any wrong movement. A month has passed. For the first time, Amy felt a strange sense of relief without the daily stress of dealing with Tony. But at the same time, she missed him. She caught herself thinking that she wanted to hear his voice not only in conversations on business. She still went to the psychologist Miller, but now alone. The doctor asked questions. What do you want from a relationship? Why haven't you divorced yet? Amy didn't know what to answer. She said that she just loves Tony despite all their troubles and is not ready to call it a day. However, I couldn't return home to this tense atmosphere yet. Tony, meanwhile, was working, and I thought. Every night, when he went to bed, he saw a picture before his eyes, Amy in their bedroom, as before, or the children huddled under their covers on a day off. The empty rooms were oppressive. At first he was angry at her, at Dan, at himself. But the anger subsided when Mike, his friend from prison, who now also lived in Lincoln Hills, told him directly, "You want your family back, but you keep yelling that it's her fault. Maybe that's enough?" And then Tony suddenly realized that the continuous reproaches and suspicions were his own wall, which he did not allow Amy to break through. He said to himself, "Okay, I'll at least try to talk to her without yelling." One Saturday, Tony called Amy and asked for a meeting without the children and invited her to come home. She agreed, although her voice sounded wary. I arrived in the evening, when gray clouds hung low over the Lincoln Hills and the air smelled of wet leaves. He was waiting for her in the living room with a mug of coffee. No shouting, no pressure, he promised this to himself. When Amy entered, their eyes met, and both felt awkward, as if they were strangers in a familiar house. "Thanks for coming," Tony said. "I wanted to talk normally. No complaints." "I wanted it too," she answered, squeezing the handle of her bag. "What's on your mind?" He took a deep breath. I'm tired of being insulted. I know that I have made many mistakes myself. I didn't listen to you. I lost my temper. And yes, that night, it sits in my head. But I understand that I cannot live forever keeping you under suspicion. I love you, Amy, and children too. I don't want us to be strangers." She looked at him, and her eyes reflected warmth mixed with fear. "I love you too, Tony. And I always said this, wrote in letters. But I'm afraid to return to you if at the first quarrel you again make me feel guilty." He nodded, clutching his mug. "I won't post it. In any case, I will try. You know, Dr. Miller said, if you want to save your marriage, you have to learn to talk about even the most terrible things, but calmly and honestly. I'm ready to try. I don't know if it will work right away, but I'm ready too." She quietly came closer. "But maybe not right now. Give me some more time. I don't want to go back and immediately fall into the old rut. I'm really afraid of repetition." Tony smiled bitterly, looking at his hands. "Understand. Unless, let's at least see each other more often. I want to take children to school, to training, to be a part of their lives." "Okay," Amy smiled at the corners of her lips. "True, Jack and Sophie will be happy. They keep asking when you'll arrive." They talked for another hour, quietly and carefully, like two people learning to move on thin ice again. At some point, Tony reached out and touched her fingers. Amy didn't move away. It was the closest touch in weeks. Another month has passed. It seemed to fly by quickly, but at the same time there was a density in each of its days like a thick fog through which you need to make your way slowly and carefully by touch. It was a month filled with short but significant meetings. They crossed paths in coffee shops, near school, in a store near their home, at children's parties. Sometimes they talked on the phone briefly, sometimes silently, but without that painful tension that had previously hung between them. Sometimes they went to the park with the children. Not together, everyone arrived in their own car at different times, trying not to show that this all resembled a date. They walked with the children among the fallen leaves, drank coffee out of paper cups, laughed at Jack's jokes, and listened to Sophie humming her made-up songs. And all this resembled something forgotten, almost painfully familiar. It was as if they were tasting life together, careful, restrained, so as not to frighten off. Tony was getting less and less angry. The tension in his shoulders was gone. He stopped constantly frowning and speaking through clenched teeth. His voice became softer. Amy no longer closed herself off as before. She didn't turn away when the conversation got difficult, and she didn't go into another room after an argument. She began to listen truly, with attention, without thinking only about what to say in response. They started talking about serious things, about things that used to cause pain and irritation: mortgage, family budget, schedules, shifts, studies, clubs. Now they discussed it calmly, with respect for the other's opinion, and what is especially important is that they started talking about their feelings, not to reproach, and to explain, get closer, understand. One of these evenings turned out to be especially quiet. It had been raining since the morning, not heavy, but persistent. Small drops drummed on window sills and car windows, dissolving the city in gray reflections. Lisa's apartment smelled of chicken soup, warm bread, and something else, something homely, dear. The children's shoes stood in disarray at the threshold. Sophie threw her backpack at the door, and Jack enthusiastically reached for the bag from Tony's hands. "Is this for me?" The boy's eyes lit up. "New designer?" "Well, of course. You yourself showed it to me in the store. I hope the instructions aren't in Chinese," Tony chuckled. Sophie immediately clung to the other bag. "What about me? What about me?" "Colored pencils. Professional, just like you wanted. You said yours were already broken." The children screamed with delight and ran into the room. The door slammed behind them. The rustling of packages, clicks, and cheerful laughter sounded. Tony remained at the door, preparing to leave. He was about to turn towards the exit, straightening the collar of his shirt, when he suddenly noticed that Amy was not moving. She stood a little further away, against the wall, pressing her shoulder against the doorframe. The light from the dim lamp in the kitchen fell from the side, making her face soft, almost watercolor. She looked at him for a long time, carefully. He was wearing a jacket, a little wet from the shoulders, and his hair was a little disheveled from the wind. He looked tired, but there was no irritation in that tired expression, only calmness, as if he had finally exhaled. "If you want," she said quietly, almost in a whisper, "you can come in. We're just about to have dinner." Tony was confused. He blinked as if trying to make sure he understood correctly. "Dinner? Together?" "Yes," Amy nodded. "Lisa doesn't mind. She's on shift at the hospital today and won't be back until late at night. I just—" She hesitated for a moment, thought it would be good for us to spend the evening with the children. All together, almost like home. He looked at her for a second or two, and then, without saying a word, he stepped across the threshold. He took off his jacket, hung it on a hook, and went into the kitchen. That evening, for the first time in a long time, they all had dinner together at the same table. The kitchen, despite its modest size, seemed especially warm. The soft yellow light of the lamp under the lampshade lay in spots on the walls, turning them into something cozy, almost fairy tale. Somewhere in the corner, a clock with a round dial was quietly ticking. The kettle on the stove was hissing lazily, as if humming to itself, and outside the window the rain was slowly settling on the glass, as if nature itself had decided not to disturb this evening. On the table there were simple, slightly worn plates. Each of them was from a different set, with different patterns on the edges. Amy had once been angry at this discrepancy, but now it seemed to her that it had its own charm, like their family itself, a little chaotic, but real. The macaroni and cheese filled the room with the smell of something warm and childish, and the garlic toast, slightly burnt around the edges, added a spicy kick, like flashes of memories of cozy evenings past. Someone spilled juice. Sophie waved her hand, and the glass swayed slightly, spilling a couple of drops onto the tablecloth. Someone dropped a fork, and it rolled under the table with a metallic clang. But no one swore. Nobody made a fuss. Everything was alive, naturally, for real. It was as if time had stepped back a little, allowing them to live this evening apart from everything else. Jack sat upright, stretched out proudly, talking with enthusiasm about the recent competition. "Dad, think about it. I assembled the tank in 2 hours, myself." He beamed so much that it seemed as if the light of the lamp intensified with his joy. His hands, slightly stained with glue, described the shape of the car in the air. "It was difficult there, especially with the tracks, but I managed. And then I won a chocolate bar, although everything fell apart for Max right at the presentation." He laughed, and this laughter, sonorous, childish, instantly filled the kitchen. Tony leaned forward and rested his elbows on the table, listening intently. He nodded, his lips stretching into a real, warm smile that held no tension. only pride, and maybe a little regret about the moments he missed before. Sophie, unable to bear it any longer, fidgeted in her chair, clapping her hands. And me, and I learned a song, herself. Mom, can I? Well, please. Of course, Amy said, bending down to straighten a stray strand from her thin braid. Just not too loud, okay? Sophie stood up, ran a little to the side, made a miniature bow like a ballerina, and began to sing. Her voice trembled uncertain, a little false, but so sincere, as if she was singing with her heart. She got lost, sometimes stammered, forgot words, but each time she started again, without losing enthusiasm. And this courage of hers was the whole point. She was not afraid to be imperfect. Amy listened, covering her mouth with her hand to keep from laughing with emotion. Jack played along with his spoons, tapping them on the plate to a rhythm he had come up with himself. And Tony watched. He looked, and something barely noticeable tightened in his chest. But not from pain. It was a feeling, long forgotten, warm and quiet, like the aching first snow on the cheeks in childhood. He suddenly realized how much he missed these evenings, not from the past, but from the world that once seemed normal. Amy, children, noise, chaos, laughter, absurdities, and all this together. He turned his gaze to Amy. She looked at him too. Their gazes met. There were no words, no unnecessary movements. Only the eyes are attentive, a little tired, but open. There was no longer any guilt in those looks. There was no condemnation, just caution. It was as if they were getting acquainted again. It was as if they were saying with their eyes, I see you, I remember who you are, and I still care. They did not smile widely, but shadows of smiles trembled in the corners of their lips. They did not touch each other with their hands, but it was as if a thin invisible thread stretched between them. It was as if they both felt that something important and real was happening now. That this dinner is not just a dinner. This is a step, promising nothing, demanding nothing. But it is very important. That night, amid the aromas of food, the clinking of spoons, children's laughter, and random crumbs on the tablecloth, Tony and Amy took their first truly sincere step towards each other. Not big, not loud, but alive. Or maybe it's with these steps that the road back begins, or forward already together. A couple more weeks passed. 2 weeks in which there were many conversations, serious, awkward, anxious. There were evening walks with children, short touches of hands, occasional smiles, and sometimes silence in which there was no longer any cold. During this time, something began to change. Not sharply, not loudly like spring, when there is still snow, but the air already smells of melt water. And then one gray, windy day, Amy and the children returned home, to their real home. Not to someone else's apartment at Lisa's, not to a fictitious, temporary place, but to where it all once began. They entered the hallway familiar to the smallest detail, with a scratched wardrobe and a hook that dangled all the time. Suitcases, bags, packages again, all this was on the floor. Only now there was no feeling of escape or escape. It was a comeback, cautious, timid, but real. Amy was the first to step into the living room and look around. Everything was in its place. The sofa where they once argued, hugging each other under a blanket. Shelves filled with books, some of which she hadn't picked up in years. Mirror with a light stain from hairspray. All this seemed foreign and familiar at the same time, like a childhood home to which I returned as an adult. We'll try from scratch, she said quietly, taking Sophie's soft doll out of her bag and placing it on the familiar shelf by the window. Her voice wavered, but she continued. She took out a box of pencils, an album, and several books. She placed them neatly, as if she herself didn't believe that she could put things back in their places. Tony stood in the doorway, watching her do this. Then he walked up to Jack, who had already sat down on the floor, fishing small parts of the construction set out of his suitcase. "Can you help me screw the shelf?" he asked, pointing to an empty section of the wall. "Yeah," Jack answered and handed his father a screwdriver. So, silently, they began to reassemble the house. Not walls and furniture, no. Namely, what makes a home is not the walls, but the people in it. Of course, their problems did not go away. No miracle erased the traces of past quarrels. The mortgage was still a burden, money still had to be counted, and there were days when fatigue lay like a thick wall between them. But now they were talking. Even if they argued, they tried to talk. They didn't leave, didn't slam doors, didn't throw harsh words that used to make even the walls shake. They started going to family therapy. At first, it was awkward sitting next to her, saying out loud what was previously hidden deep inside. But gradually, the sessions became something important, the place where they learned to hear each other again. We learned to speak not to prove, but to understand. The children noticed it first. They stopped shying away from loud voices as before. They began to laugh more often and play noisier. In the evenings, the house again heard the pitter-patter of feet, the rustling of paper, the clinking of spoons, and children's laughter. The living room was filled with scattered toys again, and new drawings of Sophie began to appear on the walls. One evening, when dinner was over and all that was left in the kitchen was the quiet bustling of dishes and the dim light over the sink, Amy stood at the sink. Her hands mechanically rubbed the plate with a sponge, but her gaze was distracted. Thoughts flowed slowly about tomorrow, about children, about what was still ahead. The water flowed in a steady stream, warm, almost enveloping. She reminded her of how once, several months ago, she stood in exactly the same way, only then tears dripped into the sink, and her heart sank with hopelessness. And suddenly, a careful touch. Tony came up from behind, quietly, almost inaudibly. His hands lay on her shoulders, not with pressure, but with that same gentle strength that she had not felt for so long. Amy winced, not from fear, but rather from surprise, from how easily his warmth penetrated her skin. She turned around slowly. There was a silent question in her eyes. "You are sure? Is everything really good?" Tony didn't respond with words right away. He looked at her, into her eyes for a long time, without fuss. And in that look there was everything: doubt, fear, pain, but also a solution. He kissed her temple softly. Her hair smelled like apple shampoo and mint, just like before. "I'm still afraid of a lot," he said quietly. "But one thing I know for sure, I don't want to lose you. And children, we will get through this together. Necessarily." Amy closed her eyes. A smile appeared on his lips, warm, bitter, but real. Tears stung somewhere inside, but not because it hurt, but because it seems that it has become easier to breathe. She put her hands on his wrists, squeezing them a little tighter as a sign that she heard, and he believes. At that moment, a piercing screech came from the end of the corridor. "Papa, look, I made an elephant out of paper. Real. Well, almost." Sophie, enthusiastic, loud, with glue stains on her cheeks, waved her new masterpiece. Tony laughed, really loudly, but without letting go of Amy, he shouted, "I'm coming, baby, now." He stood with her for a little longer, hugging her, and then slowly walked away, leaving the warmth of his palm on her shoulder. The Richardson house was becoming noisy again, and again warm. Let the fears still not completely go away. Let there be some caution in the conversations at times, and the memory of the past, like an old shadow, is sometimes reminded of itself. But now they were ready. We are ready to fight each in our own way. Take steps. Stumble, rise. Look for a language that you can speak and listen to, because they decided to stay together. And that was the most important thing. Subscribe to our channel so that your love doesn't cheat on you, and go ahead and listen to the next story, because this story is nothing compared to the next one. If you're under 18, don't even think click to the next one.